Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for coming, Prime Ministers. Welcome everybody to this panel with two Prime Ministers actually who don't need an introduction, but who have a lot in common, as Simeon just pointed out, and there's more. Both of them are trained economists, if I'm not mistaken, leaders of nations that came out of an economic crisis, the rising stars of their party families in Europe. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I said they don't need an introduction, but I perhaps need. I'm Florian. I'm with Politico, a journalist in Brussels, and I'm very honored to moderate this debate between the two of you. And as we said before, please, if you disagree with the other one, don't be shy, don't wait for me for an invitation to disagree. That's always more fun. Need no introduction, and certainly no warm-up, because you just had a lunch together and you met before. So let's just start with one issue that is on everybody's mind at the moment, the green, as it's called, certificate, the travel certificate, the vaccination certificate. I would like to start with you, Prime Minister, because you were one of the first Prime Ministers who introduced something like that, a pass for those who are vaccinated to come to your country. Why is it so important to have that on a European level ready soon?
Thank you, Florian. Welcome, Pedro. Welcome, Jan. It's a pleasure to have you in Greece to participate at what has become an important institution for global debate, the Delphi Economic Forum. It is very important to have a green certificate because we want to restore freedom of movement as quickly as possible within the European Union. It is also very important to have it as quickly as possible because we want to make sure that people will be able to travel during the summer without unnecessary constraints. When I first raised this issue, and it was immediately supported by Pedro and by most European countries at the time, it was very, very obvious that we would soon reach a point where we would have a significant percentage of Europeans who would be vaccinated, and that we would need a European common standard of vaccination proof, or of proof of illness, or of common proof that one has tested negative right before a trip. We've discussed this numerous times. We did discuss it in Porto. The technical work has progressed significantly. I do expect the certificate to be active before the end of June. And it will make our lives much easier because we won't need to be doing bilateral deals. We will all accept the common European green certificates, whereas now we would have to look at each country on a bilateral level. So I think it's going to be very important for both countries, both Greece and Spain, as we are quite dependent on tourism. I expect that people will want to travel during the summer. There is already an exuberance in our societies as we begin to open up. We're not done with the pandemic yet. We need to keep stressing that the pandemic is still with us. And as we open up progressively, we still need to be very careful and respect, the basic rules that have been identified by our experts. But people will want to travel during the summer. They should be able to come to Greece. They should be able to come to Spain with minimal requirements. And one last point, they should also be able to return to their countries of origin without additional hassle. So what applies to a Northern European who visits Greece or Spain should equally apply on their return trip to their country of origin.
That's, of course, a very good point, and maybe I can ask you. The European Parliament seems to insist that they want even more out of the certificate. The Council pushes for it to be ready as soon as possible, while Parliament wants to look at it more thoroughly and tell everybody what they can do with this certificate in all level of detail. Is that not a good approach, actually?
Well, first of all, let me thank Κυριάκου and also the Delphi Economic Forum for hosting this very important meeting. Yanis, Prime Minister, Commissioner, Ministers, thank you very much for being here. Well, I completely agree with Kyriakos. No, now we have this trilogue. The most important thing is to have an accord, an agreement in June, because we need to create a safety space in order to have European mobility. And in my opinion, to add something more to what Kyriakos said is the importance to get a lesson from this crisis. At the beginning of this crisis, the European Union management was completely insufficient. We had a lack of information, data, exchange of that information among member states to know precisely the evolution of the pandemic, especially in the beginning of the pandemic last year. So I think this digital green certificate also will improve our coordination, collaboration, and cooperation against the virus. So I think it's a very good, a very important step, the one that we are about to implement with the digital green certificate. And I think that all these ideas that the Commission launched, for instance, with this European Union Agency of Health. By the way, Barcelona is a great capital to host, Commissioner, this new agency. I think it's also part of the big lessons that we need to apply in order to have in future pandemics a better management of this kind of crisis.
You said yours.
I think there's sometimes a methodological confusion when we talk about the green certificate. The purpose is to facilitate cross-border travel. It is not to tell member states what they can or cannot do with vaccinated people within their borders. That is a different discussion on its own right. We have different legal systems, different constitutional requirements, but one should not confuse the green certificate with a right to do different things in different countries. It is simply a tool to allow for people to travel without quarantining, if I were to put it at its most basic level. That is a signal we need to send to people when they want to book their holidays, that they will be able to come to Spain or to Greece or to other southern countries. The same restrictions will always apply to Greeks or Dutch or Finns who come to Greece or to Spain. So for example, if in Greece we decide that restaurants will close at 12, they will close for everyone who is in the country. But what we want to avoid is unnecessary quarantine restrictions coming in or returning.
And then there's also, Kyriakos, another dimension, because we are speaking about the digital green certificate, but also the Commission is now reviewing the recommendation for third countries outside the European Union. And I think it's also very important to keep that unity among member states in order to have a unique response or unique recommendations vis-à-vis these third countries abroad from Europe.
Yeah. This is something we discussed in Porto, and I think it is very important. As there is always the risk of new variants of concern to emerge, if a decision has to be taken to restrict travel from a specific country, it needs to be taken quickly, and it needs to be taken at the European level and apply to all member states. I think
is that something you would propose as a...
And also it has to be current with the digital green certificate. Both this review of the recommendation for third countries and the digital green certificate.
So that should be proposed by the Commission and adopted by the Council.
And this was, I think this is something we have discussed. I think there's a recognition that maybe in the past occasionally we've been too slow to recognize how dangerous these variants of concern can be. And as Pedro said, we now have much better understanding of the nature of the pandemic, and there needs to be also better coordination at the European level. I think it particularly applies to countries, especially the bigger countries that have direct flights to these countries. But I think we are clearly moving in the right direction in terms of streamlining our policies regarding travel, be it intra-European travel or travel from third countries.
That was already one lesson learned from the crisis, if I interpret you well, when it comes to new competences that the European level should have to even better manage the internal but also the external travel coming into the European Union. Prime Minister Sanchez, is there more that you can think of as the coordination work we just discussed has shown some mixed results, I would say, in the past year. What is another topic, what another area where you think the European level should take decisions and should be able to take decisions where it can't take decisions now?
Many. Autonomy strategy. Autonomy strategy, I think, is one of the key lessons that we all remember. The precariousness of materials and vaccine production and critical supplies. And let me add that, and I also congratulate Kyriakos because he was one of the first European leaders that said and stated in an article that vaccines must be a global public good. So now we have all this debate of patents and what we do after what the US administration stated some days ago. And I also defend that approach. I think that, of course, we need to also ask the US administration to export those vaccines that they are not exporting. And the European Union, we are exporting over 130 million doses. But it's also true that it is not enough only to think about the patents, this debate of the patents. I think that it's also very important the transfer of technology, knowledge, also to strengthening the capacity to produce those vaccines, and finally to accelerate the distribution of vaccines over the world. So I think also this lesson of universal access to vaccine is is going to be one of the big debates that we are going to face during this year.
That is also a debate that you all had, and Prime Minister Sanchez as well in Porto. And Pedro Sanchez was the one, or maybe the only one, correct me if I'm wrong, who argued that the EU should follow President Biden's proposal. Did he not convince you?
No, I was. We've been more or less in line with the need to be more relaxed when it comes to IP protection, when it comes to patents. Again, as I had written an article back in a year ago, making the case that vaccines should be global public goods. I think what we've both argued is that in itself, relaxing IP protection is not going to solve the problem tomorrow, but I think we do agree that in these extraordinary times, this will be an additional incentive to speed up global production. I listen to arguments that challenge this view. I'm not convinced that they are right, but we're talking about the medium term. In the short term, I think what we all agreed in Porto has to do with the fact that we should not have unnecessary export restrictions. Europe does not receive enough credit for the fact that it continued to export vaccines at a time when still the majority of the European population was not vaccinated. We're big contributors to COVAX, and we never imposed export restrictions, as did, for example, the United States. So the first thing that needs to happen is to make sure that we have no export restrictions, that we need to look at the fact that all of our countries in Europe have purchased right now more vaccines than we actually need. That is a fact. And we will be receiving more vaccines than we actually need. We did it on purpose because we wanted to be safe and to make sure how we can channel these vaccines as quickly as possible to the ones that require it the most. But the decision in itself by Europe to purchase vaccines at the European level, distribute them to all member states on a per capita basis, making no distinction between large and small countries, between rich and poor countries, was in my mind an important moment of European solidarity. I just don't want to think what would have happened if we had to compete amongst ourselves for vaccine procurement. We saw what happened. You remember during the first months of the pandemic when we were all fighting to find masks and PPE. It was, very, very wild. So I think that we all recognize that there were delays, and I think the Commission was honest in saying that obviously we would have liked to have the vaccines earlier, but the decision in itself to purchase vaccines, the decision to purchase booster vaccines for the next 2 years to make sure that all Europeans will have access to a booster shot if that is required, which is very likely, I think is an important indication of European solidarity and a new competence, obviously, that we acquired during the pandemic that was not planned, because I think we had to sort of reinvent the wheel as we went on. So I think the vaccines on the one hand, and of course what we did with the RRF and the 5-day summit we had in July were indications of Europe really stepping up to the plate and being able to deliver extremely meaningful and important decisions and results as it grappled with an unprecedented crisis. And occasionally I'm a little tired with the Europe bashing. I think I think also within Europe, I think these were two very, very important decisions that in my mind have not received enough credit. I'm sure we may discuss it as we go on, but the amount of funds that we have available for public investments and reforms is unprecedented. We never could have imagined that we would have this additional pot of money available to transform our countries.
I'll come to the RRF in literally a minute. Just one question I'm interested at. I think the ultimate judges of how governments manage this crisis will be voters, will be citizens actually at the next time they go to the ballots. Is there something you can learn from it, or you have learned from from one another in managing this crisis over the past year?
Well, definitely for my case, the testing capacity that the Greece and the Greek government shows during especially during the beginning of the pandemic. No? So I think that's one of the big difference that Greece made vis-a-vis other governments, no? And other countries.
Yeah, I think people don't really know how we've had numerous interactions, amongst all heads of state and government. We're constantly discussing during the pandemic best ideas, best practices, really getting into the details of what it means to manage what was a complete unknown to all of us, and getting ideas regarding what works and what doesn't. But I think at the end of the day, we took a decision, which was a decision to protect, and the same was true in Spain. The same was true, I think, in almost all European countries. That yes, we will incur significant economic pain because we want to protect human life, and this was almost a social contract that we proposed to our societies, and I think it was accepted. Of course, there has been massive loss of life. It was to be expected in a pandemic of this magnitude, and we've reached the point now where we have the vaccines. We can afford to start relaxing. And it was about time, because I think we've all realized that after a year of on and off lockdowns, we had reached a point where restrictions no longer delivered the necessary results. But to those who accuse us of being too restrictive, occasionally, and it's painful for a prime minister to say, you shut down retail, you shut down, everyone wants everything open. But who knows what would have happened had we not done that? I think we know what would have happened, and I think we managed. Our healthcare systems went through difficult times, but I think eventually they managed to provide good care to everyone who required a bed in a hospital or an intensive care bed. Had we not taken these measures, I'm not sure that would have been the case. And of course, there's a difference between us we discuss frequently, is that Spain has more of a regional system. So the competences for healthcare are, but still the main decisions, the important decisions have to be taken by the government. And we listen to the experts and the expert advisors, but at the end of the day, we as prime ministers have to make a call.
Absolutely.
Yes, no, you close or you open, and I can tell you it's not an easy decision.
With a lot of uncertainty, because also science didn't know much about the virus, especially in the beginning of the pandemic. No? I think one of the biggest lessons that we have to also learn from this crisis is the need to robust our health system, especially primary care. I don't know if it happens the same in Greece, but in Spain, during the last 2 decades, regional governments were always building hospitals, which of course is important, but also very important to robust the primary care, which I think is very important in order to prevent health crises like the one that we're suffering nowadays.
A lot of lessons learned, and the money is there, as you said. We'll discuss that now. Just one, the lockdowns and the back and forth came, of course, at an economic cost, as we all know, and as we saw in the drop of GDP last year already, and as we saw in several indicators, such as in several countries, including in yours, a spike in youth unemployment. More than employment, actually, but youth unemployment. How do you avoid that the young generation pays the highest price for this crisis?
Well, I think this is the major challenge that we have. Youth and also women are the social groups that are more damaged by this crisis, like always. So, in my opinion, what we need to do at the European level is to rethink our vocational training system, to reskill most of these jobs and human capital labor that is going to change because of these two major transformations, the digital transformation and the ecological transformation. And for that, in the design that we have made in the Spanish government regarding the RRF, of course, the human capital, the vocational training, the change and modernization of our educational system, also the university system, is one of the major pillars. Because we need to, of course, skill and reskill on digitalization and other new jobs and create opportunities for the youth.
Your national recovery plan that you're talking about is, if I can simplify, about shifting away from the heavy reliance on the services sector to the green and digital sectors.
Yes.
Why is that? How is that the game changer? How is the recovery plan the game changer for the Spanish economy? Because what you described was, was an issue before the pandemic came.
Well, the national plan contains more or less 210 investments and reforms. So it's we are open a period of big transformation in Spain because of this plan. And of course, it's more or less 140 billion euros for the next 6 years. 40% of the total amount is focused on green, 30% on digital, 10% on human capital, and 7% on investment, development, and research and science. So I think it's very concrete, with very concrete reforms, very concrete actions, very ambitious, and I think it's a unique opportunity for a big modernization of the Spanish economy. The impact on our economy, more or less, the calculations that we have made represents 2 points more of our GDP, and it would create
every year? No.
No. For the next 6 years, and then around 800,000 new jobs linked to these public investments.
Prime Minister Mητσοτάκη, you calculated even 7% percentage point of GDP growth over the next
Cumulative, yeah.
Is that for your country and for the whole of Europe really a moment that has never been there and an opportunity that is not to be missed now?
The answer is yes. When we were discussing back in March of last year the economic response to the crisis, 8 of us, 8 heads of state and government, sent a letter to Charles Michel, basically requesting a debate regarding the ability of Europe to borrow as a supranational entity to support the recovery of the member states without the member states having to take on additional debt. At the time, as you remember very well, Florian, it was a dead end. However, it only took 3 months of intensive lobbying, and I think the realization by all member states, including, of course, Germany, that we needed a paradigm shift. And this is exactly what happened in July. So the ability to issue debt at the European level, to support the member states through grants and loans without the member states having to borrow themselves, combined with a loose, as was requested, monetary policy by the ECB, have created the conditions, the combination of fiscal and monetary policy, not just for a rapid growth, but for a different type of growth. And I think the real challenge is going to be not just the GDP numbers per se. I think we're all going to have rapid growth, especially I think the first year after the end of the pandemic, it's going to happen. But what type of growth is it going to be? Is it going to be a consumption-driven growth? Of course, consumption is an important element of our GDP, but that's not enough. It needs to focus on job creation, because reskilling and upskilling is important, but you need the jobs to be there in order to reskill your people to actually take them. It needs to focus, as Pedro said, on turbocharging the green transition and the digital transition, and it needs to have a strong social component, which is what we discussed in Porto, reduce gender inequality, reduce childhood poverty, reduce inequalities in general, and we should also be able to measure other things beyond GDP. I think this is going to be a very relevant discussion in terms of how we measure our performance, because Europe as a whole is not just about growing the economy. There's something more to what we call, Mr. Vice President, the European way of life that goes beyond just measuring our growth. So for me, what's fascinating about the RRF is that it fits very well into our electoral commitments. The green transition was always a very important part of our plan, but now we have the funds to actually support it. And I took the decision because sometimes you have to take a bold decision and then figure out the details of how you materialize it. Back in September 2019, I announced that within a very short time framework, we would close down all our coal-fired plants. And people initially were sort of shocked, but then when we worked through the numbers, we realized that yes, we can tell the young people in Western Macedonia that there is another future. You don't just have to think yourself as a coal miner. And we've come up with a transition plan, in total mobilizing almost 5 billion euros for that particular region that would create jobs in various different sectors. Now, of course, it's not easy to do that, and you have to have people on board. But without this funding available through the RRF, just by mobilizing private sector capital, it would have been difficult to make it longer. It would certainly have taken longer, and I think there's no doubt about that. But there's also, it probably would also have cost more. I think one of the reasons why we as Greece, again, we suffered through the very difficult second decade. We went through, through austerity policies. Greece, even more brutal than Spain. So I think we've reached a point where we realize that in the post-pandemic era, we need a different macroeconomic view that goes beyond the traditional, very strict rules of fiscal convergence that we all had to deal with.
When did you personally realize that, or when did you start to believe that the RRF would happen? Was it before that 5-day summit or during?
I think before the 5-day summit, having done the work, we knew we had to get a deal done. And then it was just about, remember the debates, how much money would go into grants, how much would go into loans, how much we will cut from here, from there. And, there were compromises being made.
How often did each of you call the Chancellor to try to convince her?
I think that history will say that the year 2020 was a great year for those who believe in the integration of the European Union. Because if you see what we have achieved during this very critical and inédit year, 2020, it's not only the commitment of the ECB, it's also the SURE instrument, it's the joint purchase of vaccines, it's the digital green certificate that we started to think last year, and of course is the RRF. In my opinion, RRF is a huge achievement politically, a political achievement, like the single market or the entrance of our countries in the European Union or the single currency. Perhaps nowadays we are very close to that agreement, but in historic terms, I think people will see this agreement as one of the major steps in favor of the European Union integration.
Would you go as far as to say that this is a Hamiltonian moment, as somebody put it, as in a step towards a...
No, there were many, I think many countries will dynamize this debate with non-papers, with joint letters before the Commission, having meetings with Chancellor, with President Macron, with others, also with the Nordic countries. So I think it was kind of course, I remember those conversations, especially with northern countries, with the Scandinavian countries. One of the major reasons why they were in the end in favor of this agreement, the RRF, was because the RRF also represents a defense of our single market, which is one of the biggest achievements of the European Union construction. So the territorial dimension of this crisis is also something that we have to keep in mind, because the territorial divergence that could create this pandemic was absolutely disruptive, in my opinion. So that is why I think that we all understood that we need to strengthen our single market with this kind of massive public investment.
Apart from that those very concrete results, do you think, you mentioned the austerity, do you think the RRF and the crisis management will leave a mark a good mark on the reputation of the European Union in your countries, where maybe the EU is still...
Absolutely.
Yeah?
I think so. I mean, not only because of the RRF, but also because of the vaccines, and also with all this coordination that we are creating regarding the European Union health. So I think that of course the image that we gave as European and common political project is completely the opposite to the one that we experienced after the financial crisis. And let me add one thing. In the end, what we did is to give a positive response, not only to the crisis, but what Κυριάκου said, to this major disruptive change and transformations, the ecological transition and the digital transformation, and to give a triple inclusive perspective. The territorial one, the intergenerational one, and also the gender one. So those three inclusive perspectives to these two major transitions, I think is also in the heart of the RRF.
Is it enough to have this one fund, or do we need a second fund, or does it need to be a permanent one, a permanent option for the EU to borrow money jointly?
We discussed this during our meeting. It all depends on how well we use the money. At the end of the day, it's up to us to make sure that the money is spent and invested wisely in accordance with the plans we have devised. And we've put the Spanish plan is excellent. That's what we hear from the Commission. I think we've also done a pretty decent job in terms of what we have submitted. But at the end of the day, we know that both of our countries have a legacy in terms of absorbing EU funds. So we know we need to step up in terms of being able to absorb the structural funds which are there, the common agricultural policy which is still there, the main pillars of cohesion and support for our primary sector, while at the same time, on top of that, also adding the funds from the RF. I think that if this money is wisely spent in accelerating the twin transitions, I think it's not going to be a one-off event. So it really depends upon us to make sure that the approach is the right one. Pedro is absolutely right when he says that the way to convince the so-called frugal countries was to explain to them that at the end of the day they will also benefit if the single market recovers. For example, Greece does not produce any electric vehicles. Yes. It has to buy them from somewhere.
Spain, for example,
Spain produces. Yeah, but just to give you one example. But I think the answer is the aim should be this not to be a one-off fund, a one-off financing event.
But following his reflection, I think that if you compare the figures of public investment in my country, Spain, after the economic crisis of 2008, the level of that public investment was ridiculous. It was really, really depressing, the figures, because we didn't have financial maneuver to increase that public investment. This RRF give us the possibility to increase public investment. But the critical, let's say, point is the one that Κυριάκου said. This public investment plan must provide the financial conditions to boost private investments. Because in the end, what we need is to create the conditions for a sustainable investment and sustainable policies. Not only on the energetic side, but also on the digital transformation, human capital, and so on and so forth. No? So I think that if you see the RRF, the Spanish RRF, what we are focused on is, for instance, in the digitalization of our public sector, or the reform of the justice reform, no? Or as I mentioned before, the vocational training and the educational system. So these are major reforms that we need to develop in our countries, and the RRF provide us to develop these reforms, but with a positive approach. And this is I think key and a big difference between this situation and the one that we suffer after the financial crisis.
Part of the compromise and also part of this integration step is what some frugal countries wanted, that there is a kind of emergency brake in case, or an emergency brake in case those national recovery plans don't work. Is there anything that you have heard from the Commission, as you said, in any national recovery plan that would raise a red flag and make you want to intervene?
Well, frankly, not really. I think it's interesting that the countries which were treated with more skepticism were the ones that have submitted on time, well thought out plans. So
you went about it very McKinsey-ish, no? You had an auditor before you even submitted, and
I don't want to, I don't want to label the work that we've done, but I think we've really, the countries that stand to benefit the most have really thought hard about this. And at the end of the day, I don't expect any country to sort of look at subparagraph X of the Spanish or the Greek plan and tell us.
So far, the conversation that we have with the Commission has been very, very positive, really positive. And in the end, our citizens must know that all the reforms that are included in our plans are already known by the public, because they are compressed in the country-specific recommendations, which was, by the way, the agreement that we reached in July 2020. So far, the experience that we have with the Commission during these long months from last July till now has been very positive.
Change, of course, happens through joint conclusions and through crisis and to working against the crisis, but also through personnel changes. This year is an interesting one and an important one in European politics also, because you mentioned her before. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is retiring actually this year. How do you see, it's a very open question, how do you see the Europe, the post-Merkel era? Will it change a lot, or is it just, as you're very used to in the European Council, somebody else coming in and somebody not coming anymore?
Well, I was not in office during the financial crisis. I remember the reputation that the German government at that time has in my country, but now it's completely the opposite. I think that Merkel and her figure will last historically as one of the major leaders that provides a positive response and a pro-European vision of the different challenges that we have ahead. No? I have a very, very good, very constructive relations with Angela Merkel, even though we come from different political families. I see on her more pro-European vision than some colleagues from my own political family at the European level. And I think that she understood that this economic crisis and social crisis that at the beginning was this pandemic needed to have a different answer than the one that we as Europeans provide with the financial crisis.
I would agree. I think that tectonic plates of European politics have, to a certain extent, been shifted by Angela Merkel when she moved away from her sort of total resistance to what ended up happening last July. And to her credit, I think she saw the need for Germany to play a leadership role. I think, as was the case with common vaccine purchases, you'd expect the biggest and richest country in Europe, if they only looked after their own self-interest, to procure vaccines on their own. It would have been easier for them, probably, than most other countries. So I don't expect a change in the approach on behalf of Germany. Of course, I've been at the Council not as long as Pedro has, but certainly Angela Merkel is a tremendously experienced politician with an ability to forge compromise when necessary, and she will always be a European at heart. But at the end of the day, that is the nature of the democratic process. Institutions should be able to transcend individuals, and I'm sure
her presidency was remarkable, not only because of the RRF agreement, but also because of the MFF agreement, the agreement with China on investments. And so I think, her presidency was absolutely remarkable last year.
I would like to ask you one last question, as we saw a lot of things, because we need to wrap up slowly. We need to, as we saw a lot of things that you have in common and not a lot of differences between you. One thing that is different from your backgrounds is that Mr. Mητσοτάκis, your family has been in politics for a long time. Yours has not. I would like to hear from both of you. Was there a moment when you decided, I want to do this and I want to go into politics, and what was that moment?
In my case, I was 14 years old. And I realized that my grandparents, they didn't know how to write, how to read. and I realized the injustice of a dictatorship that lasts for 40 years in Spain. When I was 14 years old, Felipe González was already in office. And I realized that the Socialist Party was a party that modernized Spain, that made possible that Spain joined at that time, in the 80s of last century, the European Union and what happens afterwards. So if I have to answer to that question, what was the specific moment, is when I realized that my grandparents suffered a historical injustice that many generations in Spain suffered during the Franco dictatorship.
Was there a moment like that? Not like that. Was there a specific moment for you?
Well, my story is slightly different because I grew up in a political family, so I can tell you there were certainly many moments when I told myself I would never ever enter politics. And it did.
That's what I thought. But when did you change mind? In the
end? It did take a long process, a career in the private sector, and at some point I think you realize that the essence of democracy is contribution to the public domain. As someone who came from a sort of quote-unquote privileged political background, I knew it would have been, and it was easier for me to make my first steps in politics. So I said to myself, how are you going to convince someone who doesn't have your advantage to enter politics if you don't do it, and if you feel you can really make a change, give it a go. And I think when you start in politics, you never know how it's going to go. Pedro knows very well. There are ups, downs. There's sometimes when you think you're completely out of the picture, and then something happens, and it's not I can tell you, it's not an easy, it's not an easy job. But there are times when you feel that you're contributing towards important change. When you say, yeah, well, all this it is actually worth it, because at the end of the day, you cannot enter politics if you're not utterly convinced that you can change things. If you're just cynical and have the approach that, nothing changes, it's irrelevant who governs, people are irrelevant, parties are irrelevant, ideologies are irrelevant, you might as well, stay at home or limit your contributions to social media posts. But if you really feel that you can make a difference, then, get involved at all levels of public engagement. And the biggest problem I think we will be facing, and this is a challenge for democracy going forward, is to convince young people to make the necessary sacrifices to enter the public sphere, especially at a time of social media, when there is no distinction between public and private life, when character assassinations are the norm rather than the exception. Recruiting talent, to use sort of a more business-like term, for politics is going to be massively, massively important for the next generation, the people that will come after us. But it all starts with the belief that you can actually change things, and that if you really feel passionately that you can make a difference. No guarantees of success in our job. Things can change very quickly, we all know that, but it's worthwhile giving it a go.
Last question really to both of you. As we saw an erosion of the traditional political landscape across Europe, and I'm not referring to specifically to your country, but also in your countries, are you confident for the classical political parties from the center left and the center right, and the Christian democracy and social democracy, that they have a long and prosperous future?
I think this crisis gives the reason to social democrats. Really. When we speak about solidarity, intergenerational solidarity, climate change, for instance, you're speaking about social democracy, or at least as far as I understand social democracy. When you speak about the need to have a strong welfare state, a strong health system, you're touching, speaking the foundation of the social democrats in Europe. When you speak about the need to have an inclusive perspective of this huge transformation which is the digital transition. I think that you're also speaking about social democracy. So in the end, I think that in the past, Europe became what it is nowadays because of the, let's say, the approach of social democratic vision to the answers that our society needed before, in the present, and also in the future. So I think that social democrats, we will have a stronger presence in the future.
The crisis as the moment for social democracy. I give you the chance, of course, for a very...
Well, in our case, it was the center-right that was essentially the only party that survived, the rupture of, the political earthquake that essentially almost, blew up the political landscape in Greece. In our case, the traditional, social democratic party was replaced by something which, in my mind, has very little similarity to social democracy, the way at least Pedro defined it. And it was a center-right that managed not only to survive, to thrive, and to strengthen, but it did so, I think, because maybe it became less ideological, more practical, more forward-looking, and able to do the sort of the big synthesis and the big, changes that were required by a very changing landscape. There is no, in my mind, the distinction between, for example, a big and a small state is irrelevant. You want an efficient state. And if the state needs to be present at a time of rupture, it has to be present. And who would have expected, I was joking with my minister, my alternate minister of finance, that it was a center-right government that has spent the most money ever in the history of Greece supporting the real economy. But it was necessary, and it had to happen. Is the green transition ideological by nature? I'm not sure. It goes beyond ideology. It has to do with, the fate of our of our children. Is there an element, in my mind, which is very important, that has to do with the reduction of inequalities and creating a more inclusive form of capitalism? I would say that this vision can be compatible. It can be as compatible to a social democrat as it is to a politician coming from a center-right. We may have different recipes, but no one, I think, today can acknowledge, also from the center-right, that the wild injustices created by an unregulated capitalism are economically but even morally acceptable.
Thank you for these two pleas. One would almost hope that the two of you at one day compete for a European office for your respective parties. That would, of course, be a lot of fun, very interesting. And I thank you for this discussion that covered a lot of ground, from saving the summer that's in front of our doors to the future of political parties and democracy. And thank you very much, and thank you to all of you.
Florian, thank you very much for chairing so well. Thank you deeply. Before we adjourn, we would like to present a small statuette of liberty to the two Prime Ministers, as well as to Prime Minister Janša. We made this because of the bicentennial of our Greek Revolution this year. We thank
you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really good. I hope you liked it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good discussion.
Nice.
That was good. Prime Minister, nice to meet you.
Thank you. There you go with our...
We thank you deeply for joining us today. Thank you. Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Thank you very much.